Hello, everybody. My name is Patrick Lowe. I'm a member of the of the Multilateralism Group, and previously I spent many years in the World Trade Organization and a few years in the World Bank. I left the World Trade Organization in 2013 and was living in Hong Kong, working for a think tank for a few years, but have tried to keep in touch with all the goings on in the World Trade Organization. So we're going to talk about subsidies in the context of industrial policy. And before we start on that, I invite John to introduce himself.
Thank you, Patrick. It's a pleasure to be on this show with you today. And my background, I'm also a member of the Friends of Multilateralism Group. I am also a fellow of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute in Canada. For many years, I was a Canadian government official. And during the Uruguay round, I was the Canadian ambassador to the GATT. And I also came to Geneva as ambassador to the World Trade Organization in 1995 for a 4-year term. So I like Patrick, I maybe don't follow it quite as closely as he does, but I still consider these matters to be extremely important. And I very much enjoy following them and offering my 2 cents worth every now and then.
All right, thanks very much, John, for that. Let me make a few introductory remarks, and then we can get on with our conversation. Industrial policies, and particularly in the form of subsidies, have exploded rather dramatically in the last few years, and this is particularly the case with respect to the 3 largest economies: the United States, China, and the European Union. And they've all got new, relatively recent legislation, which are basically the conduits for significant amounts of subsidization to high-tech manufacturing and so on. We'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. So, for example, the United States has the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a bit of a misnomer for what it's really there for. And it also has the Chips and Science Act. The Europeans have the European Green Deal and Digital Europe program. And China has the Made in China 2025 program. So these are the instruments that are being unleashed for significant increases in subsidization. And there are many questions around this in terms of what it's going to mean for the multilateral trading system and for multilateral cooperation. Just to be clear, this is probably unnecessary, but just to be clear, what we're defining as a subsidy, this sort of universal description of a subsidy, is any price-based or regulatory intervention that changes relative costs or returns, in other words, misaligns production costs and prices in the market, nationally and or internationally, to the advantage of a subset of producers and or consumers in the subsidizing market. So that's what we're talking about. Obviously, this instrument has been around a long time. There are WTO rules on that, which we may get to later. But that is what we're looking at as the policy instrument. Now, the form it takes, it can be regulatory in nature. It can be a regulation which favors a particular production operation. It can be financial or fiscal. It can involve giving special access to particular enterprises, like things like energy, land. It can also be a regulation that accords specific exclusive rights to particular enterprises, essentially gives them state monopoly status. And then, of course, there are the state monopolies themselves, which you'll find in all these economies, but particularly in China. So these are all the instruments which create those divisions between production costs and prices that I referred to a moment ago. So turning to you, John, what do you think are why has this happened? Why have we got this explosion?
Well, I think it's a combination of factors.
Mm-hmm.
And one is that there's been a lot of ferment in trade flows over the last few years and in the relative competitiveness of countries. So I think there's been unease in major countries, including the United States and the European Union, about whether they still remain competitive in the current international economic environment. And they're particularly worried about competition from China. Another reason is that there are, it's become clear that making some of these major changes, like towards managing climate change or trying to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases, is a major task, and one that probably does require certain government support to assist with the necessary adjustments that will take place. So you've had a combination of these things, in a sense, coming together. And I think, to go back to what you were just talking about a moment ago, we've seen a situation arising now where countries are, let's take the United States as an example, and I'm not trying to be critical, I'm just trying to understand what's going on. But in the Inflation Reduction Act, they offer a considerable incentive to consumers, financial incentive in terms of rebate, if they buy an electric vehicle. And this is, but then the question becomes, well, which electric vehicles are eligible for this rebate? And this is where you get into really the trade effect. So there, and this focus, in the case of the United States, it focuses largely on where was the battery made, and where did the components of the electronic battery come from that are in the vehicle that is being sold. So that some of these vehicles are not eligible because the components of the battery do not come from the United States or countries with which the United States has bilateral free trade agreements. So you have a combination of subsidies and regulation, which operating together have a very powerful impact on trade flows and potential impact on trade flows.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the geopolitical situation has certainly exacerbated this desire to make sure that countries are not dependent on one another, these major economies. And that is also immediately drives into competitiveness concerns and the ability to produce what are considered strategic products domestically. And the problem is, I think, is that, you can see some of these subsidies being needed potentially to save the planet. I mean, if climate change isn't getting enough attention, we're not doing enough fast enough to reduce carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, then governments are tempted to lend a hand. And that obviously can involve all sorts of policy interventions, not least of which will be subsidization. The question then, of course, and I know that this has caused some people some concern, is this going to be a lesson for the new way to run the world economy? And we'll get countries after countries. I mean, Canada, for example, will Canada follow suit? Will other countries follow suit? If they do, it's going to be very, I mean, apart from all the distortive effects and apart from what that'll do to economic growth and competitiveness, being located where it really belongs, will be how we manage in international cooperation, especially in a world where, if the subsidy is the main instrument, especially in a world where there are many countries who can barely afford them.
Well, I think your analysis is correct, and I think one of the challenges that faces countries now and people who are interested in understanding trade policy and trade policy development, one of the big challenges is to try and get a collective understanding of what is actually happening. And I think it's or benefit these kind of subsidies backed up by regulation are the largest countries, the richest countries, and and the ones with the largest domestic market. So when they deploy the subsidy, it can have a larger effect than a country which doesn't have a large domestic market. So I think this is becoming a subsidy rate that is going to pose severe challenges, particularly to medium-sized and smaller countries that are interested or rely on exports to earn their livelihood in the global economy.
Do you have any sense of the magnitudes of all this? I know that Simon Everett has been using the Global Trade Alliance to try to identify specifically what the landscape looks like in terms of subsidization.
Well, I think you're right, and I think the work that's been done by the Global Trade Alert and Simon Everett, and also the recent launching of the new Industrial Policy Observatory, I think it's called. So I think all of this is extremely important and provides a lot of valuable insights into what's going on. I do remember from looking at this a few months ago that it's become obvious now when you look at the trade factors affecting trade that are identified by the Global Trade Alert having an adverse effect on trade. The policy measures that have risen to the top of the index now are subsidies. And so subsidies are having the largest restrictive effect on trade, particularly in the larger markets. This certainly wasn't the case a few years ago. So it seems to me that we've got to do some work here to really understand what's going on. And very helpful to have the work that the Global Trade Alert has already done. But in my view, that can't really supplant the need for beginning to figure out how to develop a collective understanding among countries about what's going on and whether or not anything ought to be done about it. If I might go on briefly, I think, if you look at the recent meeting of ministers of the World Trade Organization, I should remember what it is, and at what we call in the jargon MC13, the 13th Ministerial Conference of the organization. This is one of the issues that they discussed was, should they begin a process of having an organized deliberation on industrial policy and the role that subsidies are playing in that. And I wasn't at the meeting. I'm not a member of a government any longer. But my understanding from scrounging around on the internet to find information suggests that there definitely was a discussion of whether or not that kind of work should be initiated. And unfortunately, in my view, a number of countries, although there would seem to be a strong support for such a move, a certain number of countries didn't think it was appropriate, and therefore there was no agreement on moving that work forward. So I think it's time for a sort of stock taking about, all right then, how do we proceed from here?
Yeah, I mean, I think because there's such a strong overlap between the new economy, the digital economy, and a lot of the stuff that's being done is benefiting from subsidies is on the high tech side. Things like electric vehicles, various digital processes and products. If we can't get a handle on subsidies, we risk not getting a handle. I mean, I'm talking about the WTO. I'm no longer there either. If the WTO doesn't get a hand on subsidies and find some way of disciplining them, I'm afraid that it's going to be a real additional problem for all the problems the WTO subsequently faces, not least of which will be that it'll frustrate any meaningful chance of having a digital economy agreement, or what's called by the WTO e-commerce agreement. I think these things are going to run into each other if we don't find some way of addressing the subsidies problem.
I think, when you mention these major subsidy industrial policy programs, they come from the three largest trading entities, the U.S., China, the EU. And it seems to me that that's sort of the center of where the geopolitical friction is likely to become exacerbated. And so I think these countries may conclude that it's in their interest to try to put some form of discipline on this, or get a better understanding, at least, to try to figure out what is this doing to their relationships, the relationships between these countries, and is this something that's a cause for serious concern or not? I would think it is, and so I forget. I had another point, but it slipped my mind. And yes, I do like continuing to say "we" as if I was still, representing a government, which is no longer, of course, the case. So,
but this is the effect.
We can speak the truth now, Patrick, more clearly than we could before.
This is true, but
clearly as we could when we were younger.
But this place seems to have a hold on people even many years after they've had nothing more to do with it.
That's right.
So let's just go back a moment to this question of good subsidies versus bad subsidies. I mean, it would be wonderful if we could be very clear and say subsidies are wonderful or subsidies are just a disaster and we don't want to see any of them. But we can't, because there are circumstances in which subsidies will be in the public interest and will be what economists would call address positive externalities and internalize them so that the society benefits. Or market failures for that matter. So if you could identify a bunch of subsidies like that, the sorts of things they could be for is preparedness for health or dealing with climate change, avoiding natural disasters of various descriptions. One can think of things that it is the responsibility of governments to take care of, that they will need to intervene in order to do. So that's one thing. Now, how do we determine that? And crucially, how are these subsidies designed? Are they designed to be double dual purpose, in the sense of, okay, we're going to make sure we get this, but we're going to do it in a way which favors our people over the foreigners? And unfortunately, that seems to be very much the pattern. That after all, foreigners don't have a vote, do they? So once you open the possibility of working with good subsidies, you're simply raising a very serious policy challenge to make sure it's done in the right way with the maximum amount of international cooperation. And then there are subsidies which would be very hard to defend in any kind of way other than protectionism, pure and simple. And the difficulty I see is that the distinction between these is important, and maybe we could negotiate better on it. But either way, absent international cooperation, there's going to be fallout that affects other countries. And so even if it's a good subsidy, you can see how it could lead to subsidy competition. You could see how it could lead to wasteful subsidization, to suboptimal competitive conditions. And so I think that whatever way you look at it, even if we accept the distinction between good and bad subsidies, we're going to have international cooperation to address this in an adequate fashion. the problem with this, if you make a distinction between good and bad subsidies, you might think, well, that'll make life easier. And in a sense, it might. But the problem still remains that if countries aren't cooperating, there can be competition over good subsidies as well. And then you could have an excess of good subsidies and it'll just be a mess. So whichever way we cut it, absent international cooperation on this, I think we're headed for some rough times when a lot of things could go wrong in the world economy, because these are the biggest. These three entities account for a huge amount of international activity. So I think it's even though we want to preserve the difference between good and bad subsidy, we have to recognize that both require international cooperation.
I agree completely, and I think it's getting the design, even for purposes where we think subsidies would make sense and are perhaps even necessary. I think we have to be careful about the design of subsidies, because as you know, as you pointed out a few minutes ago, they can serve dual purposes. Some of them might be designed to try and make sure that the lion's share of the production of a new technology happens in a particular country, and others will be designed to create conditions in which new technologies can emerge. And the second sort of set of objectives would be worthy, if I could put it that way, whereas the first set are kind of protectionist looking. And I think what we're seeing now is a combination of the two. Seems to me, going back and looking at the World Trade Organization agreement, it would be very useful to do some thinking about the way in which the experience of the operation of the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures in the WTO. Because it was set up that certain subsidies were prohibited, certain subsidies were tolerated, provided they didn't create adverse economic effects for other countries. And in the original design that was part of the final act in Marrakesh, there were also subsidies which were green subsidies, in a sense, that were allowed provided they met certain conditions. And three types of subsidies were identified for that broad category: those dealing with research and development, those dealing with change to new environmental regulations and conditions, and also those dealing with regional development in various countries. So those slipped away, but it's interesting to see that back then, how long ago was that now? Quite a long time ago.
It was the year 2000, because that thing was in place for 5 years, subject to explicit approval.
That's right.
For continuation.
But when it was when the agreement was negotiated, was back, of course, in the
early 90s.
Well, a lot of this was done in the late design of it was actually done in the late 80s, and then became, with the final machinations to bring the agreement together, with, of course, the early 90s. And but it'd be useful to go back and look at what were people thinking at that time, because this is not the first time there I am again, have had this discussion, and I think there could be some things that could be learned by going back and looking historically at this. Obviously, things would need to be adjusted. Clearly, the first effort to put together an agreement of that magnitude could almost by definition benefit from improvements after experience with this operation. But I think it's had a significant effect, and it's on a subject that is becoming today perhaps the preeminent subject in the realm of trade policy, given the impact that it's having on restricting trade, particularly in major markets.
Yeah, I mean, that fight. I think there are a lot of people who thought that addition to the subsidies agreement, which was subject to confirmation 5 years down the road, was really forward-looking and made sense. Quite a few people thought that. But when it came to the time to renew it, it wasn't a question of objecting to it. It was a question of a consensus decision to carry it forward. And there were a lot of developing countries who said, why do we bother? The subsidies is a rich country's problem. It's nothing to do with us. We don't do this because we don't have the money for it. And I think that was probably rather short-sighted. I think it would have been great if that had continued, because I think now if WTO can do something, get some action going, something like that will definitely have to be part of the picture. But maybe you need other things. Maybe you need a different kind of cooperation as well, which is a bit of a dream at the moment because of the amount of cooperation it would require, but somehow to divvy up different parts of what needs to be subsidized, and particularly in climate change, I think.
Well, any worthwhile agreement, I think, begins with a dream. So don't say that a dream is
All
it's a bad idea. But I think but the problem is you won't have any kind of international agreement on these matters if we don't start some kind of discussion now. I think it's premature to start setting the objectives of the countries might agree upon they would try to look for in the future. But it's given how important these matters are, I think it's essential that a discussion begins so that we have a better collective understanding of what's going on. And then people can get subsequently to a point of saying, so do we need to do something about this? And if that's the case, what?
Yeah, I'm afraid that at MC13, it was definitely discussed. There was definitely a suggestion that there should be some kind of process started in the WTO. But again, it was blocked by a few countries who just said we're not interested. And I think honestly that's a bit short-sighted, because this will spill over into all sorts of ways into international trade, competitiveness, the capacity to benefit from international trade. The
Well,
other thing, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say on that, and you said this earlier, but I recall, I believe the Director General saying it at the time of the ministerial conference, that this is it's the smaller countries with small budgets and small economies that are going to be the victims of this kind of world. They can't compete in this subsidy game that's being unleashed at the present time.
Yeah, unless they set up ring fence some of their own economies, but again, that's just getting left behind. I mean, I think it's really hard to see. Yeah.
Yeah, I think right, but then that's going back to the sort of old world of increasing the barriers at the borders
Exactly.
and creating conditions in which global trade will be reduced. And as certainly, as a representative of I don't know whether Canada's a small or a medium-sized economy, sort of in there somewhere, but it's throughout my whole career in trade policy, our concern has been to try and create conditions through rules in which we have access to markets that can allow the Canadian economy to produce more at scale and be competitive on a global basis. And in going down that road where we use the WTO, we use regional agreements, bilateral free trade agreements, but the general direction has been trying to move in the direction of openness.
Yeah, I think the other problem that I see mentioned often in the literature on this is that we already have a significant difficulty in the WTO with notifications and transparency as to what different countries are doing with respect to their trade policies. This one is even more acute. It's like it's a jungle. Nobody really knows what is going on. I suspect some of the governments themselves don't know because there are different authorities doing different things. But the transparency imperative, I would have thought, was absolutely central to anything useful happening in the WTO.
Absolutely. And the other point is it's costly, to the Treasury. If this sort of competitive race that we're really in the early stages of becomes more intense, we're going to see situations in which governments are going to have to look at reducing expenditures in other worthy areas in order to continue their subsidy war. And, at some point it might occur to people that maybe a little bit of disarmament might be worthwhile.
Yeah, it would be good. Of course, when we were at school learning economics, we were told that subsidies were infinitely superior to border measures, and that if you were going to do it, you should do it with a subsidy. That seems to be coming back to bite us now.
Well, I don't think people weren't looking at how subsidies can be connected with regulation in order to allow people to benefit from them as well. So that it's not just subsidies; it's the way in which they're designed that can have more nefarious effects.
And things that don't even look like a subsidy but have a subsidy effect.
Yes.
Like you get a special price for your land, or you get a discount on your energy, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And anyhow, I think we probably exhausted this for the time being. And thank you very much for allowing us to have this conversation. And let's hope that one day progress is made.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure engaging in this discussion, Patrick.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Let's hope it leads to something good.